Everybody likes a good story, and nobody likes telling a story more than people in the movie business. And when I say telling story, I mean actors, directors, and writers in interviews telling stories. Now that can be fun sometimes, and most of us know to take it with a pretty much ton of salt, but a lot of people believe it and keep believing it. And I've never quite understood why so many people believe in so many far-fetched stories that they hear. But they do. And the internet has made it about 1 trillion times worse. I think one of the reasons people believe stories that come out of the mouths of actors, directors, and writers, people in the movie industry, stories that are just clearly, patently false, comes from a lack of understanding of kind of how movies work, how theater works, how writing works, how acting works, all of it. One of the greatest misunderstandings is the art of improv. Oh man, that's a big one.
I thought perhaps if you and your wonderfully talented pupils just improvise, something might reveal itself.
A lot of people seem to think 40, 50, 60% of all dialogue in movies is improv, if you're to believe the Access Media stories you read on actors in movies improvising lines. And I'm not just talking about someone like Ryan Reynolds in the Deadpool movies, which we'll get to in a second. No, I'm talking about Sean Connery in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I've lost count at this point how many times I've heard people say, and how many stories I've actually seen online, where Steven Spielberg or Julian Glover or Harrison Ford or somebody is saying that Sean Connery improvised the line, "She talks in her sleep." Now, according to any number of variations you've heard on this story, Connery improvised the line, and of course, everybody just cracked up on the set. One of them says, I think that Spielberg said everyone was in hysterics and falling on the floor, and they just couldn't cut it out after that. And obviously, this is completely innocuous and trivial, and who cares? In the greater scheme of things, none of this matters. But I guess what amazes me is how many people read that and believe it. Guys, come on! One of the easiest things you can now do on the internet is actually look up working scripts. You can also look up drafts of scripts. You can find out what was written in the screenplay before actors were ever even present. And if you go to The Last Crusade, you can find that Tom Stoppard, under a pseudonym, did some revisions in 1988, a good year before the movie was even made and released, before Connery was even on board. And there's a script, and there's the line, in a Stoppard script, "She talks in her sleep." Of course there is. I guess one of the things that bothers me when people believe in all these stories of actors improvising lines is they never ask, well, what was the original line? In other words, if Connery improvised the line, "She talks in her sleep," then what was the original line? I mean, it's got to be in the script, right? Because Harrison Ford is asking, how do you know she's a German spy? And if Connery improvised "She talks in her sleep," well then, that means there was another response in the script. What was the original response? Also, I think people in general just have a really bad idea of how improv works. Like, even in a movie, if you're improvising lines, you're not really doing it in front of the camera. You're probably doing it at the reading table. When you're all sitting around for the table read, that's probably when most of the improv is going to happen. And when I say improv, I mean kind of working with the lines and trying different things and seeing what might work better than what's written in the script. That happens. And then it gets refined and put into the movie and then acted out. But it rarely happens right there on the set in front of the camera while it's rolling. Even in some of the most famous cases in movie history, it didn't really happen that way. For instance, with Dr. Strangelove. It's often been told that Peter Sellers improvised most of his lines in Dr. Strangelove. And Terry Southern, who wrote the screenplay for Dr. Strangelove, disputed that and said, no, I wrote all of that stuff in the script. He refined some of it and played some of it a little differently, but for the most part, I wrote that all down. So who do you believe? The people saying Peter Sellers improvised everything, or Terry Southern, who wrote the screenplay and said, no, I wrote it? Well, if you watch Dr. Strangelove and you want to believe that, let's say, Peter Sellers is improvising all of his lines, then all you really have to do is look at the rest of the movie. Does anything Peter Sellers is doing in Dr. Strangelove seem tonally, jarringly different from everything else in the movie? Do other characters' lines seem boring and dumb and not really that funny, but only Peter Sellers' lines are really good? Or do they all roughly seem like they have the same satirical tone for the whole movie? They do, because Terry Southern wrote it. Now, what happens with improv, I think what throws people off, is that when you're sitting around the table for the table read, there was probably some basic words that Terry Southern had written for Sellers' conversation with the Soviet premier, Dmitri. And Sellers probably riffed on what was in the script, and then Southern took notes, and then they kind of revised it again, and they did a little more tweaking, and then by the time they got in front of the cameras, they went with what had been finalized in the script. When you're making a movie, especially in the days when you were dealing with celluloid strips of film that could not be re-recorded over once you did a scene and it messed up, it was not advisable to just go out in front of the camera and start making stuff up. You really need to kind of stick to what the script says so you don't throw everything off and waste a ton of money. In fact, if you're going to improvise, you really better know what you're doing, because, again, that is going to piss off a lot of people, because a lot of people need to get everything exactly right for those shots to work. So they don't need you going in front of the camera and just going off script for 3 minutes. And as a result of that, most actors don't go off script for 3 minutes. Here's the other thing about actors. Because again, I am an actor. I've acted on stages for years. I've made my own movies. I've worked with actors. I've interviewed them. I've written about them on Turner Classic Movies. And actors are terrific people who are also kind of sort of full of a lot of the time. They embellish stories in their heads so often that they eventually themselves come to believe those stories. And they will conflate what happened at a table read and then what happened with constant revisions with the writers with something actually happening spur of the moment on the set. Here's another good example. You know how in Raiders of the Lost Ark there's that, of course, famous scene with the swordsman twirling his sword around, and Indiana Jones has just had enough and he's tired and he just pulls his gun out and he shoots. Now, how many of you, and I'm assuming if you're a little bit older, it's a lot of you, have heard the story that Harrison Ford wasn't feeling well and he didn't want to do any more takes and he just pulled out his gun and ha ha, everyone just died laughing and Spielberg said, "We're keeping that in the movie." I'm sure a lot of you have heard that. Now, how many of you have believed that? Here's where I'm hoping it's like 3 of you, because I'm hoping the majority of you know that, come on. Before the internet, most of us, if we were little kids, and I was a little kid, so you can cut me some slack there, most of us just kind of had to believe stuff like that. But now we have the internet and, well, you can just find the scene on the internet as it was originally shot. Like they did all that rehearsing. They did do the whole thing. What they did was they filmed the scene with him fighting that swordsman, and they filmed alternate takes with him shooting that swordsman, and Spielberg decided that the alternate takes with him shooting the swordsman worked better. That's what happened in reality. You're making a movie. It takes time. things have to be set up. So, if Harrison Ford indeed was just too tired to do the scene, then why is there footage of him doing the scene? It's like that Journey song, Don't Stop Believing, except remove the word don't. Stop believing. There are people out there right now who honestly think Ryan Reynolds is just coming up with like 50 or 60% of his Deadpool dialogue while the cameras are rolling. Guys, he's not. Come on, he's not. They're writing all of that stuff down. Improv doesn't happen in front of the camera. Now, here's another thing about improv. I'm not saying it all works like this, but I've worked in improv. I've been involved in improv theatrical groups. Now, again, I'm not saying they all work like this, but this is one of the tricks of improv. What you do is this. You sit around in rehearsals and you talk about ideas. What's something we can do? And someone says, let's do something with like a pet shop. Somebody's got to go in and they've got to get a really embarrassing medication for their dog who's having some kind of a really gross bowel infection. And then someone else comes in about their cat, and then they make jokes and this and that. And then you get your actors together, and everybody kind of starts riffing on that. Some of it's funny. A lot of it isn't. You go back and you do the stuff that was funny, and you start riffing on that. And then somebody else has an idea. Oh, wait. Maybe the person with the cat says this. And then they try that. And then after about 100 different variations, they've got a pretty solid core for this improv on the pet shop. Now, nothing's written down. There's no actual written script. So technically, it will always be improv. No one's actually learning lines. But before they go on stage in front of an audience, they've rehearsed the improv you see them do quite a lot. One of the ways they do this too is kind of the ways magicians force. So in my improv group, that's what we would do. You refine those skits, like the pet shop one. We'd have these little cards where it would have like 40 different situations. You know, emergency room procedure. You know, somebody at the police station. Someone going to the pet shop for their dog. And inevitably, someone's going to choose the pet shop one, and you go through the cards and you say, blankety blank from row 3 said pet shop. And then we all improvise the pet shop scene. But not really. I mean, it is improvised. There's no actual written script, but we knew what we were going to be doing with that skit once that thing got called out. In other cases, if you're just having people call out things in the audience, you just have a couple of plants in the audience. Make sure somebody calls out pet shop situation for a dog. That's pretty much how that stuff works. And that's how improv works in movies too. Ryan Reynolds probably does come up with a lot of the stuff he says in Deadpool, but he's coming up with it not in front of the camera. He's coming up with it as they work through the script, as they do rehearsals, as they do the table read. That's when he's coming up with it. And then they're working it in and writing it down and refining it. And then they're filming it. So, you may hear stories all the time about amazing things that happened on the set and how everybody improvised and this guy came in and that lady walked over here and she said this line and we all just fell down in hysterics. Don't believe it. I mean, seriously, don't believe it. It's what Hollywood does. They love you, the viewer, to think that it's kind of a loose, free association atmosphere on the movie set. It's not. It never is. It never was. Peter Sellers was basing everything off of Terry Southern's script. Ryan Reynolds does not improvise everything he says in Deadpool. And no, Sean Connery did not come up with the line, "She talks in her sleep." Anyway, that's all I got for now. Thanks, and drive safely.